The bright side of addiction is recovery. And recovery begins with hope. Hi again, everyone. I'm Neil Scott, and if you're new to our podcast, we welcome you. And if you've been here before, welcome back. And if you're in recovery, or know or love someone who is, or maybe you simply want to know more about the recovery process or long-term recovery, or maybe you're a bit concerned about someone you know or love who is harmfully using alcohol or any other drug, this is the podcast for you, as we carry the message of hope and the promise of recovery. And a reminder, you can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. Recent episodes have featured interviews with rock and roll legend Dion, Tom Farley, the brother of the late Chris Farley, astronaut Buzz Aldrin, who was the second man to walk on the moon, Broadway legend Ben Vereen, plus conversations with everyday people in long-term recovery, sharing their story, their insight, their path. Now, in this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, we're going to visit with a woman who puts recovery in motion. She recovers out loud and is proud of her long-term recovery. Her journey, that's rife with twists and turns and ups and downs and all-arounds. But she's been in long-term recovery for the past 18 years. Her story is incredibly inspirational. And by the way, she is a curator, a sober curator. In fact, she designed, developed, and delivers the Sober Curator, an amazing online resource. A little later in the podcast, I'll tell you how you can access the Sober Curator. Here's a quick clip from today's podcast.
I try to live by this moral compass. I don't do it perfectly. I'm super flawed. I usually, by the end of every day, owe somebody an apology, but I try my best. It's not about not making messes anymore, because you're still going to, but when you do make them, it's cleaning them up. And by doing that, I feel very grounded and centered with my spirituality.
My conversation with Alysee is coming right up, and we will conclude today's podcast with some wonderful closing words from award-winning actress Jamie Lee Curtis about sobriety. Our website is recoverycoasttocoast.org, and if you'd like to help us out financially or know of a foundation that might be interested in underwriting part or all of our program, we would be very, very grateful. A reminder, our email address is recoverycoasttocoast, one word, at comcast.net. Recovery Coast to Coast is supported by Sundown M Ranch, one of America's oldest, least expensive, and most successful treatment programs. They're listed in Newsweek magazine's recent list of America's top treatment providers. Sundown's just about a month away from celebrating their 57th birthday. They have successfully treated some 200,000 adults, adolescents, and family members. It's an intensive residential program in central Washington, right at the mouth of the gorgeous Yakima River Canyon, on 30 acres which they own. Sundown was started by compassionate business people back in 1968, and it was the first one in Washington state. It's abstinence-based, it's 12-step centered, and the staff is amazing. Kind, considerate, compassionate. Many of them are themselves in long-term recovery. Patients are treated with respect and dignity. Their motto is, "The patient is the reason we are here." You see, Sundown is a not-for-profit treatment program. Their bottom line is long-term recovery and not financial gain. And they don't just treat and release. They foster continuing care. They help each patient build a bridge back into the family, their job, their community. And each patient is also given names and numbers of 12-step contacts, as well as Sundown alumni members. You know, recovery does not happen in 30 days of treatment. Recovery is a lifelong journey. The first 30 days, which oftentimes are essential, is just the beginning. Sundown understands the recovery process and what it takes to maintain a new recovery lifestyle. Sundown M Ranch remains one of the most affordable addiction treatment programs in the country, and they are in network with most insurance companies. If you're considering a treatment program for a loved one or friend, who knows, maybe yourself. Do your research. There are a lot of bad actors out there, so-called rehab programs that mainly are out to make a buck. Do your homework, but please consider one of America's pioneer treatment programs, Sundown M Ranch. It's where recovery begins, sundown.org. Oh, there's the coffee pour. That means it's conversation time. And I invite you to join me for a cup of coffee, or whatever your beverage is, as I introduce you to an amazing woman who wears her recovery on her sleeve and in her heart. Here now is my conversation with Alysee Bryson. Our next guest on Recovery Coast to Coast is Alysee Bryson, a woman in long-term recovery and a very successful entrepreneur. Among her many accomplishments is being the founder of the Sober Curator, which is an online lifestyle resource that curates and creates original content for the recovery community. I absolutely love it, and I guarantee you will too. In fact, we're going to tell you how to access that a little later in the podcast. It's one of the top 15 recovery blogs in the freaking world. Alysee also serves as the Vice President of Community Development for Work P2P. I've been trying to get her on as a guest at Recovery Coast to Coast for a couple of years, but it's hard to hit a moving target, and Alysee is constantly on the move. I finally got to meet her face-to-face, heart-to-heart at the recent King County Behavioral Health Legislative Forum, which I moderated a few months back at Seattle Center, thanks to my good friend David Coffey from the Recovery Cafe. And we finally put this interview into motion. Now, when you go to her website, which is AlyseeBryson.com, you'll be greeted with the following. You can take the girl out of the party, but you can't take the party out of the girl, because drunk never looks good. And she is not only in long-term recovery, she believes that getting sober matters, but staying sober matters more. She's a staunch recovery advocate, truth seeker, writer, and a fellow podcaster. It's so great to catch up with you, Alysee. How are you?
Well, after that introduction, I am fantastic. I'm just going to need to take you around with me and be like, what he said.
Let's begin at the end of your drinking and the beginning of your recovery. How did you tumble into a life that is happy, joyous, and free?
My special day is May 1st, 2006. Ironically, I was working at the Seattle Times as I was nearing my bottom or the end of my drinking rope, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And I was carpooling with a gal that I worked with. We got free parking if we found someone internally to carpool with. I don't know if I would have been friends with this woman on my own. We ended up becoming really good friends, to be clear, but I don't know I would have sought her out on my own. But we lived in the same, north end of Seattle. So we started carpooling together, and I was definitely had a lot of drama going on and chaos going on. My life was very unmanageable, you might say. And she was stuck in a car with me about 45 minutes each direction, 5 days a week. So she got an earful, and she would always just be really patient with me and be like, yeah, I know what that was like. If you ever want to learn how to let go of all of that, I'm happy to share my story with you.
Wow.
And for the first 6 months, I was like, no, thanks. Not interested. I'm good. I'll just keep talking about myself. So she was pretty instrumental in helping me. And I did not go to an inpatient treatment, but I did do an outpatient treatment that was 3 days a week, 3 hours a day. I was a single mom. I'm still a single, but I was a single mom. And so I couldn't wrap my head around going away for a month, but I could wait until it was summer break and my son could go stay with my parents, and then I could work during the day. I could do treatment at night, and I could see my son on the weekend. So, I was trying to project manage my bottom okay job. So that's kind of what that looked like.
Where did you go to the outpatient program?
I went to Residence 12, which was in Kirkland. It is no longer. It went away right before the pandemic, if I'm remembering correctly. But it was around for a long time.
That is,
women only.
I am so familiar with that, Alysee. My ex-wife was one of the founding board members of
then
Residence.
You know all about it.
Absolutely. Loved that program, and was so sad to see it go down. It was just a shame.
I was too. And what was really ironic when I went there, Neil, is in my early 20s, I worked for AT&T. This is way back when they had pagers. Did you ever have a pager?
Yeah.
Yeah, we all had pagers, right? And we were not Well, some of us were drug dealers, but that wasn't necessarily why we had pagers. So back when pagers were very popular, before cell phones were everywhere, I worked for AT&T activating pagers. And when you bought your pager at Best Buy or wherever and you called to get it activated, you might have talked to me. And so ironically, that was just like a couple buildings down from this Residence 12 facility that I went to. And when I was working back at AT&T, that was the very beginning of my real alcoholic drinking. And so it just really felt like it came full circle that I ended up back in that neighborhood at the end, which is just kind of a weird coincidence, I guess.
Or God incidents, as they say.
Or, yes, exactly that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Residence 12, when it was still going, I brought a friend of mine up from Southern California who's a singer-songwriter named John Batdorf, and he'd just come out with a new album called Tracks to Recovery. And he had a song on that CD, and when we finish the interview, I will send it to you, and I will also put it in the podcast notes for people who want to listen to it, called Mama's Coming Home Tonight. It's basically the story of a family that is welcoming mom back after being in treatment. It's amazing. And there wasn't a dry eye in that place. I can remember that moment like it was 2 minutes ago. So I will send that to you, and I'll put it in the program notes. Is there anything for just women now in the Seattle area?
Not that I am aware of.
I recently found a button that I got in Washington, D.C. probably 30 years ago, a big orange button that said, alcoholism is a woman's issue.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you leave Res 12, and then you go into the rooms. What was that first year like for you, Alysee?
When I checked into treatment, I already had 30 days because I had learned about the treatment and I had gone into the rooms, and then I was waiting again, like I'd mentioned, for my son to go on summer break. I had 30 days in the rooms before I checked into treatment. I don't know if that was a good or a bad thing because I had more sober time than anybody else that was in my class, all of 30 days, I thought then,
you were an old timer,
better at this whole thing than everybody else. I was working for the Seattle Times as an outside sales account executive. So I had a lot of flexibility with my schedule, and my home group was located in Ballard. That at that time I could get to Ballard on my lunch break pretty easy. And I went to a noon meeting that was offered there Monday through Friday. And I was there, more than I wasn't. I'm not sure that I made it every single day, every single week, but I was there quite a bit. And, I did all the things. And back then I quickly made some friends. I quickly caught on to like the buzzwords of the program and watched what people did. Like, serious people put book covers on their book and they do this and they do that. And I'm really good at looking the part of something, faking it, if you will. Mm-hmm. I did get a sponsor, but all I really ever did with her was Wayne for hours. We did read out of the book some, but I was not super eager to get into any step work at all. But I managed to stay sober for the first couple of years, just kind of doing all that, faking it. Then I kind of crashed and burned at about 3 or 4 years sober, not physically, but emotionally. I was in a place where my mental health was really not well. And my career had taken off after getting sober. I had left the Seattle Times and I'd moved over into magazine world, and I was doing really well there. And I loved being at a lifestyle magazine and everything that came with that. But I was severely depressed and not medicated and not working any kind of a program. I was emotionally, spiritually bankrupt and suicidal. I didn't actually consider going back out or drinking or using because I've done enough of the research. I know where that ends me up. I just didn't know if I wanted to live. And that was a really scary place to be. And I remember one day I was out on a sales call. I had gone over to Bainbridge Island to go to some casino, and I'd taken the ferry to get there. And I was coming back. I had just missed the ferry, which put me as the very first car in line for the next ferry. And I couldn't stop crying. And there wasn't anything wrong other than I was just this really broken soul. And the only thing that had changed is I wasn't drinking, I wasn't doing drugs, and I was working a lot. But all my other behaviors, a lot of yucky ones, were still pretty much the same. I was just really broken and unhappy with myself and couldn't stop crying. And as I watched the ferry come in and people getting off the ferry, and then, they were going to get ready to reload us, this thought occurred in my head that I could drive on and then drive off the other side like Thelma and Louise right off the side of the ferry. Once that idea got in my head, I was terrified I was not going to be able to stop myself from doing that, which was a really out of body experience. It was like almost like I was no longer in charge of my actions. And it was very scary. And fortunately, I had a sponsor and I called her and she stayed on the phone with me. I obviously did not Thelma and Louise off the ferry. And when I got across to the other side of the water back in Seattle, she stayed on the phone with me and I drove myself straight to an emergency room and then got some additional help. And then it was after that was such a wake up call for me that I threw myself everything I had into the 12-step community and really worked every step as rigorously, honestly as I could. I didn't realize that the reason I wasn't getting any of the promises is because I wasn't doing any of the work. It became really clear when you put in the work, like the boss, the universe, God, whatever you want to call it, provides.
Yeah. There's a big difference between going to meetings and working the program.
So it's two totally different things.
Absolutely. Once you were able to renew, if you would, your recovery, what's life like for Alysee?
Life was great, Neil. I went on my amends tour. I made my amends. And you're not going to believe this, but before I was halfway through my amends list, a lot of crazy things started happening. I started making more money. I started being promoted through my job. I started sponsoring women. And things were going really well. My life was really things were falling into place. And I was happy, I was joyous. I was living my best life. That said, I loved what I was doing for a living so much, working at this magazine, that it became my new addiction. And between probably year 6 and year 10 of sobriety recovery, I became a full-blown workaholic. Now, I was still doing all the 12-step stuff that I needed to do, so I was ignoring the fact. I wasn't being honest with myself that about my workaholism. I was just like, no, I'm just a really hard worker. And I just love doing this. This doesn't work for me. I had a sponsor that at about 9 years, she called me out on it. And she said, if you don't figure this out over here, you're doing great in some of these other areas, but this has become a problem. And if you don't figure this out, you're going to have a heart attack. And at the time I was 39. So I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm 39. I'm not anywhere close to having a heart attack. I'm fine. Calm down, right? A month after I turned 40 at 10 years sober, I had emergency heart surgery.
Oh my God.
Yeah. I worked myself. I did not have a full-on heart attack. I was having precursors to a heart attack, which are called anginas. Kind of an unfortunate word, if you want my opinion. But they're basically baby heart attacks. And when they got in there and put a stent in, they found out that my LAD, which is often nicknamed the Widowmaker, was 95% blocked. And most of the time when someone has blockage in that artery, they die instantaneously. For whatever reason, I did not. And that was a huge wake-up call. And at the same time, a lot had gone on. My son had just graduated high school. We had just moved from being out in the suburbs more into the city. Work was going really well, but it was a lot. There was a lot of things going on. My son, who was 18 at the time, got diagnosed with Crohn's disease, and he had to have a major surgery. And so we kind of went through this 5 or 6 months of our life was like a country song. Like everything that could go wrong did. Between my surgery, between my son's surgery, I fell and got a concussion. Our TV broke. Our dog went to the emergency vet. Everything that could go wrong was going wrong. And really that was God or the universe's way of telling me you're going to have to walk away from all of this. I went on a sabbatical at the end of 2015 and our dog did end up dying. Our 4-year-old dog ended up dying. For a reason, the dog dying is what really jolted me. My heart surgery was traumatic. My son's surgery for his Crohn's, traumatic. But I was figuring that out. There's doctors and science that could help with that. But the dog being gone, for whatever reason, was the straw that broke my camel's back. And I was just like, everything has to change. I can't do any of this anymore. So I took a short sabbatical, 6 weeks. And at the end of that sabbatical, it had become very clear to me that I was not going to be able to return to that job and that lifestyle because in the couple of months I had tried to do the job after the heart surgery and I had tried to work a normal 40-hour week. I was not able to do it. And so I walked away from all of it.
What a journey. I mean, your sobriety obviously severely tested with all of those traumatic incidents, and yet you remain sober. Did you stay close to the program?
I did. I did stay close to the program. And during that time, I definitely did. I didn't drink over it. People would pick me up and take me to meetings when I wasn't able to drive myself. For the first half of 2016, I just spent time rebuilding my house, rebuilding my son's house, trying to figure out what was next. I started thinking, well, maybe I can go, now that my son is grown and graduated and going to go off and have his own life, maybe I can go and work for a magazine in New York or LA, because I'd never lived anywhere else. And now the world was my oyster. And then when I really thought about that, I thought about how much networking it takes to be in the media business, and how if I moved to another city, I was going to have to start all over again with networking. That's a young person's game. That's not for me. And so I realized I was going to stay here in Seattle, and I just needed to figure out some different options. By the end of 2016, I was working at King 5, the local NBC affiliate, on lifestyle content. I was there for about 6 years, and that was a really great place for me to be. I was able to really establish a work-life balance where when I left the office, I really left the office. I didn't take the work home with me. And so I was really able to practice having a healthy relationship with work. And in the middle of all that, I ended up getting diagnosed with cancer. I had stage 1 melanoma on my leg and had to have a big chunk of my leg taken out. I like to refer to it as my shark bite now, because I think it makes me sound tough, but it was not a shark. That was hard. That was a really hard thing to go through mentally, because there was a month where I didn't know how far the cancer had spread and if they had gotten it all out. And this is my PSA for wear your sunscreen, don't do the tanning beds, because I had been a sun worshiper up until that point, and it did me dirty for sure. And I was in a great place, and that was a great place for me to rebuild how I needed to show up at work and how I needed to turn off. Because, Neil, surprisingly, when I like something, I like it a lot.
Your drug of choice is more?
My drug of choice is more. Yep. It doesn't matter if it's shoes, if it's work, if it's something that I enjoy and I like, for whatever reason, I go into the land of too much really easily. So I have to be careful with that. And that's tricky because, when you're being helpful, when you're being of service, like even that can be too much. And that can be a little tricky because you're like, but I'm doing good in the world. But It's like, yeah, are you? Are you? And how much of your ego is in there?
Yeah.
So, the last couple of decades, I have learned a lot about myself. My journey is far from over. I had a woman ask me that I mentor a couple months back. She was like, can you tell me, like, how many years were you sober before you stopped being a jerk to people? And I was like, oh, I don't know. I'll let you know when I get there, though. Like, I don't think I've reached that level. So, it's just a process. I am so grateful for where I am today and how my program has shown up in my life. But there's still a lot more to do and a lot more to learn.
How is your son doing today, and how did he react to your emergence into recovery?
My son was 9 when I got sober, and so he definitely does have some memories of my before. He definitely does. I've always been very open and honest with him around recovery, the fact that mommy has to go to meetings. Sometimes he would go with me, and I'd, throw some headphones on him and put a video game in his hand. But a lot of times I was able to work my schedule around so it didn't impact him too much. I've just always been really open and honest with him. Not at the very beginning. He didn't need to know everything. He still doesn't need to know everything, right? But he knows enough. We've had a lot of open dialogue around it, and that, genetically he's going to need to pay attention to what happens when he uses any kind of substance. I don't know that he has what I have. He seems really be able to regulate. And, he's the kind of guy that can have a blizzard and only eat half of it and then put the rest in the freezer and forget about it. So he has this like turn-off button that I didn't have. He's doing great. His Crohn's has been in remission.
Great.
He's 28 now. He actually works at a dispensary. He got very involved in medical marijuana as a result of his Crohn's because he had a hard time having an appetite and a hard time keeping weight on.
Sure.
And he's become really educated in that field, and he's really passionate about it, but he's also really responsible in it. And so he is on his own journey, but he's doing great.
Who's been the most instrumental, influential person in your recovery, Alysee?
There's been a handful of people. It would be hard to pick one. There was a woman named Rita B. She lived in Ballard. While she was never my sponsor, she was just at 2 or 3 weeks sober, Neil. I remember being at a meeting on a Friday, and I was still very new. I didn't understand any of it. I didn't know that if you announced in a 12-step meeting that you were going to use, that people would mob you after the meeting because they would want to help you, right?
Yeah.
And that happened. And then when the crowd went away, little Rita came up, and she was at the time definitely in her early 80s, I believe, maybe late 70s. And she couldn't have weighed more than 80 pounds. She was just this little thing, super scrappy, definitely to the beat of her own drummer. She said, here's the deal. You're going to pick me up tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. You're going to take me to a meeting because I need a ride. You can't drink tonight because I don't ride with drunks. And here's my address. Here's my phone number. Don't be late.
Wow.
And I was terrified of her. And so I didn't drink that night, and I got up early, and I went and picked her up, and I took her to that meeting. She made me take her to another meeting. And then when that meeting was over, she actually made me take her to Northgate Mall so we could go to the C's candy shop that used to be there. She only lived on sugar. So we did that. And then she took me to another meeting and another meeting. And by Saturday night, we had been to 6 or 7 meetings. I hit a wall. I hit my meeting wall, and I said, Rita, if you will let me take you home so I can go home, I swear I will never drink again. Please don't make me go to another meeting. And she pursed her little painted lips and said to me, well, my job here is done. You could take me home. And what I learned that weekend, Neil, is that the people in the 12-step community, even the ones you don't know, even the ones you don't even like, they will show up for you, and they will help you get through that time that you don't think you can get through yourself. And that was a really significant meeting and meaningful experience for me to have so early on. Even when I didn't knowingly ask for help, people would show up and help me. And that is a lesson that I've never forgotten, and that I myself have tried to be then helpful to other people that needed help.
What is the role of spirituality in your recovery?
Spirituality to me is really important. I am not God. There is a God that is greater than me that I can't always fully comprehend or even describe. I spend a lot of time talking to my higher power throughout the day, and I try to live by this moral compass. I don't do it perfectly. I'm super flawed. I usually, by the end of every day, owe somebody an apology, but I try my best. It's not about not making messes anymore, because you're still going to, but when you do make them, it's cleaning them up. And by doing that, I feel very grounded and centered with my spirituality. And I think I grew up in a Christian home. Both my grandfathers were pastors. So the concept of God was not hard for me to reach in a way that some other people that come into the room, they feel challenged with the God subject. It was not. It was very easy for me because I'd grown up in a house with faith, and I'd grown up with a God of my understanding. And that's evolved over the years for sure. But I do feel like when I spend more time listening and serving than I do talking and deciding things, like that is when I'm at my best. And when the answers do come, and they just come.
What advice do you have to someone who says, I've tried 12-step groups, they just don't work for me?
Oh my gosh, I've heard that so many times. Here's what I can say. I've a lot of people it hasn't worked for. I've never met anyone who's thoroughly worked all 12 steps and it hasn't worked for. So if it hasn't worked for someone, I would argue they probably haven't worked the steps, or they haven't worked the steps thoroughly and honestly, because I've just never met anyone who's done every single step 1 through 12. And 12 means taking somebody else through all steps 1 through 12, right? I've never met anyone who's done all of that and done it as honestly as they could that it didn't work for. I just haven't. It doesn't mean those people aren't out there. I have just not crossed those paths. But I've met a lot of people who just sit in the rooms and don't do anything, like I did for the first couple of years, that it doesn't work for. A lot of people that don't get honest with themselves, and they do it, but they lie throughout all of it. I did some of that too, to be clear. Just like if you're baking a cake, if you don't follow the instructions, the cake may not turn out like the picture on the box.
Wonderfully said. Tell me about the Sober Curator, how that came to be and the inspiration behind it and how it's going today.
Sure. Well, given that I've had a career in media and predominantly lifestyle media for the last 2 decades, I am a lover of all things lifestyle, a lover of all things pop culture. And in 2006, when I got sober, social media was just getting started. I think I was on MySpace, right? So there wasn't sober Instagram, sober TikTok, sober Pinterest, sober YouTube. There wasn't a million podcasts. The book section at Barnes and Noble was very small. So there just wasn't the landscape of all the options there are today. And I'll be honest with you, as those things all came online over the last decade, I wasn't really paying attention at first because I had already found what worked for me and it worked well. So I didn't need to go find more things. But around 2015, 2016-ish, I started paying attention to this movement that was happening online, and more books were coming out and podcasts were coming out and Instagram accounts were forming. And I started paying attention, content that was created for people that were thinking about getting sober or in early sobriety, which is important and valuable, but didn't meet me where I'm currently at as someone who had over a decade. About 2018 or 19, I came up with this idea like, what if I created a lifestyle magazine for people in long-term recovery that talked about the things that we think about or enjoy or want to do as a person in long-term recovery? Because I just didn't feel like there was as much out there for people that were doing the deal with no days off that there were for early recovery. And again, it's not to bash any of that other stuff. I probably would have used it. It had been around when I was in their early recovery. It just wasn't. And so I couldn't find it, but I also was still pretty busy and enjoying my work-life balance. Love to travel. I'm a gal about town. I love to go to events. I love to go to museums. I wasn't willing to slow down enough to figure it out. And then the pandemic happened. I realized that it wasn't going to be over in the original 3 weeks they promised, and that we were going to be in it for whoever, we didn't know how long. And I was compromised with my health, and my son was compromised with his health. So with the information we had at the time, we needed to stay home and protect ourselves as much as we could. That left me with a lot of free time. And so at first I craft and I made banana bread, but then I realized, I want to be able to look back on this gift of time that I was given. And I want to know that I did the most with it that I could. I want to be intentional about this free time of not commuting and extra time at home. And so that lifestyle blog, that magazine you wanted to start, you could do it now. And I had taught myself enough about WordPress, building my own website. I knew everything about social media, being an early adopter. I knew how to run a magazine because I had done it. So I knew the fundamentals. I wasn't necessarily the one that should build a website or do the graphics or do the writing or do the editing, but I knew just enough to be dangerous. In August of 2020, I launched the site with 3 other people because I knew that if we were going to create this ultimate resource, that have to be multiple people putting content into it. And I have great taste. I have great opinions, I think, but not everybody agrees with me or likes what I like. And so I wanted it to be representative so that anyone in the sober or recovery community, whichever label works best for you, would feel like it's a place for them. And I still wanted the emphasis to be on people in long-term recovery. So we launched with little money and little strategy, and we just start before you're ready. Just go. If I had waited to make it perfect, it would have never started. We just launched it. I treated it like I treated 12-step program with attraction, not promotion. I didn't spend any money to get people to follow it. I was like, if it's good, people will follow it. If it's not, people won't. 4.5 years later, I have 37 people contributing to the site. Most of them are in the United States. 2 are in Canada, 2 are in the UK. I'm not doing it exactly full time, but I probably spend 50 to 60% of my work week time on it. And I have a couple people working on it full time. We're getting ready to launch a podcast,
Great.
A group podcast with all the contributors. We've got different people writing on different things. So we've got beverage reviews, we've got movie reviews, we've got podcast reviews, book reviews. We have a retreat calendar, sober events calendar. We write about celebrities. We write about mental health. We write about fashion. We write about shopping. I mean, we just write about anything that you would want to know if you've chosen a sober or a recovered life as your lifestyle choice. It's just all done through the lens of sobriety and recovery. And we're having a lot of fun with it.
How can people find that?
We are at thesobercurator.com. So that is the easiest place to find us. We have an email list, about 16,000, and we send out an email every Monday. Sometimes we forget and it goes out on Tuesday, but usually it goes out on Monday. We are on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, also I guess that's X now, Pinterest, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And we have about 5 to 7 new articles posting every week from the 37 different contributors. And there's almost 2,000 pieces of content on the site. So you could go to our movie review section and scroll through the movie posters, and you can see what we have as a group, what we've scored the movie. And then if you click on the movie poster, it'll take you to the trailer and the review of it and why we gave it the score that we did. And we have that for TV shows and for books and for podcasts. So it's really become a really fun project. It's never ending because there's so much content out there trying to capture and curate and review that it feels like we're never going to finish because there's just so much happening in the space.
Your story, your life is really, Alysee, bathed in gratitude. And I often say recovery is living proof, and you certainly embody that, Alysee. You're doing a great job. Your story is very inspirational. Let me ask you in closing, what does recovery mean to you?
Recovery, to me, ultimately means that I promise myself that just for today, I am not going to put any alcohol in my body, and I'm going to try to be a better person than I was yesterday. And I'm going to show gratitude, and I'm going to be of service in ways that I am uniquely gifted or skilled. It also means I'm going to ask for help when I need it. But it really is a life of gratitude and service. And when I stay in those two lanes, it is the sweet spot for me. Everything else tends to work out if I stay in that spot.
Recovery certainly is something that should be progressive. You know, alcoholism and other addictions are progressive in a negative sense. They continue to get worse. In recovery, it should be the same going forward. It should be progressive. A lot of treatment centers have relapse prevention programs. I don't like to call it relapse prevention. I've stopped doing that. I call it recovery enhancement. How is your recovery different today than it was yesterday? You must be moving forward. It is a growth process in recovery.
Yeah, I've got the core things that, I adopted around that 3 or 4 year mark that I talked about earlier in this conversation that work for me. But I also do more than that. I am on some antidepressants because I went to a doctor and a psychologist and they're like, this is what you need. I have been to therapy. I've had a life coach. I've been in group therapy. I've done art therapy. I do yoga. I've done meditation. Like, I'm just always kind of like upping my game. And it doesn't mean all the time. I also consume a lot of content. I love to listen to other people's stories and learn from what they've learned from. And I love creating. And there's not a destination I'm going to get to, but I do have to be progressive with my recovery because it is, as you mentioned, a disease that is out to get me.
Absolutely. Alysee, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast and sharing your story and your insight and showing your amazing gratitude for all that was and all that is. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Alysee, and I encourage you to make the Sober Curator a part of your recovery journey. By the way, I want to remind listeners of this podcast that if you would like to tell your story of recovery, regardless of how you got sober, the path you've chosen, as long as you have been in continuous recovery for a year or more, drop me a note if you would, recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Coming up next, actress Jamie Lee Curtis defines sobriety for her. She'll do that in just 30 seconds.
Are you afraid? Afraid of life without drugs and alcohol? There is help and hope at Sundown M Ranch. At Sundown, the focus is on you and your disease. You will learn how to live without depending on drugs and alcohol. Sundown M Ranch is nationally recognized for effective and affordable alcohol and drug treatment programs. Reclaim your life. Replace your fears with hope. Go to www.sundown.org right now to learn more.
And now, as promised, some closing thoughts on recovery, on sobriety, from a woman who lives it one day at a time, actress Jamie Lee Curtis.
Nobody gets sober to walk with the stone of oppression on them all day. The whole idea is to drop it and say, that was the past, this is now. I have made a decision to walk free from it and walk through all of the pain and shame and terrible suffering to get to something better. And so to me, sobriety is the great wash of freedom.
Well, that wraps up this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. If you've enjoyed our podcast, please share it with at least one other person. You can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, our email is recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Also, please hit the subscribe or follow button. It's free, and you'll be notified the next time we publish a podcast. If you're considering treatment for a friend or a loved one, be sure and visit NAATP.org/AID. That stands for the Addiction Information Directory. It's a listing of those treatment programs that adhere to strict ethical guidelines. One of them, of course, is Sundown M Ranch, but there's a lot of other good treatment programs around as well. And remember, if you know someone who's experiencing problems with alcohol or any other drug, here's a 24-hour national helpline that offers free information and confidential treatment referrals. Spanish-speaking individuals available as well. 1-800-622-HELP. And we encourage you to check out findsupport.gov. Now, that's a website designed for individuals, families, and friends, including information on how to pay for treatment, including low-cost and free treatment options. Find healthcare support. Find out how to help someone else or find help for yourself. It's all in one place at findsupport.gov. And join us next time for America's Voice for Recovery, Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. And another shout out to our sponsoring organization, Sundown M Ranch, where recovery begins. Sundown.org. I'm Neil Scott, reminding you to stay healthy, live in gratitude, and be kind to others. Remember, the bright side of addiction is recovery. Pass it on.